Hi, I'm 200. This is the first video that I'm doing on the transition from the classical to the medieval period. So in this one we're going to talk about these terms, classical, medieval, and what was involved in shifting from these periods. But we're also going to talk about why these periods are kind of problematic ideas to begin with. I think they're useful, but at the same time we shouldn't just take too seriously that there's this like big shift. Okay, the idea that there's a difference between the classical and the medieval, we can trace back to itself an idea that comes from the Renaissance, and we're going to be talking about the Renaissance later in the course. Well, Melissa's going to be dealing with that with you. So the Renaissance saw the medieval period as being this like dark age, right? And the classical period beforehand as being superior in a lot of ways, and the Renaissance looks back to the classical period. So we, looking now back at this whole 1,000-year span between when the Roman Empire was around and then when it transitions into Germanic kingdoms and the spread of Islam, and then eventually you have people in Italy looking back to what they call the classical world as a model to emulate, right? And we can say, well, yes, obviously some big important changes happen, but are the distinctions that clear-cut? Well, they aren't super clear-cut, but at the same time, it's not as if they're coming from nowhere, this idea that there's this important transition. And really, the important transition in the area of the world that we're interested in, primarily, right, the area sort of around the Mediterranean, has to do with the collapse of Roman power, okay, political power, cultural hegemony, okay? So I want to show you this slide from the slideshow that should be up on Blackboard, and you can look at it at your own time. This slide gives you a bit of a time frame to think about how first the Western Roman Empire is replaced by these Germanic kingdoms, and then how the Eastern Roman Empire isn't destroyed yet, but is certainly transformed, is massively shrunk by the expansion of the Islamic world that happens after Muhammad institutes the new religion of Islam, and then his successors as caliphs spread their power and influence over a huge area extending ultimately from Spain all the way east into India. Okay? So that's the sort of framework that leads to us thinking of this transition as being kind of real. So when these humanists in the Renaissance start talking about the classical world, they have some specific things in mind. And these things pretty much line up with what we've been talking about in Hum 100, right? So they thought of the classical heritage as being primarily the heritage of Greece and Rome, right? And historically, that heritage is embodied in the Roman imperial culture that spreads across this huge area surrounding the Mediterranean, starting in the early, the last century of the before Common Era, and then becomes sort of fully imperial in the first century of the Common Era, right? So all through Spain and France and east into what we now call the Middle East, is this area that is under the authority of the Roman government, and which, maybe even more importantly for our purposes, is becoming increasingly culturally Romanized. So people speak Latin throughout the area, although in the East, Greek is the more common, right? It's the language that people ordinarily speak, but Latin is still used. The accoutrements of Roman civilization become increasingly widespread. So the taxes, but also the urban life, so local elites who are embedded in the Roman governmental structure and are adopting a lot of Roman cultural traits like wearing togas and worshiping Roman gods and learning Latin or Greek and sort of reading the same authors, listening to the same poetry, being into chariot racing and gladiatorial shows, all of these things that spread out and Roman hegemony establishes. Okay? And from the later perspective of these Renaissance thinkers looking back at what we're calling the classical period, really it's the literature and the literary culture that's the most important. And this is very wide ranging, right? So it is written in Greek and in Latin, so in two languages, and it covers philosophical writings, scientific writings, medical writings, what we now call sort of magical writings, so like astrology and things like that, a lot of legal things, very practical, like treatises on military tactics, on how to speak well in public, how to run your sanitation systems, all of these things, right? So this Roman world is producing all of this culture, right? And a lot of it is sort of lived culture that doesn't leave too many traces except for in these written works, okay? And that Roman culture was embedded in this political hegemony that was this kind of pyramid with elites at the top, and at the very, very top, by the time period that we're talking about, is the Roman emperor or emperors, okay? And so Augustus had been the first Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, and then his dynasty succeeds him, and then there's emperors after emperors. We probably heard already elsewhere about the crisis of the 3rd century, right, where things kind of fall apart for Rome, but Diocletian and Constantine kind of bring it back. And that is the sort of framework where this transition away from the classical world happens, okay, because the sort of Roman power and governmental authority and military hegemony is more or less restored by the reigns of Diocletian and Constantine, but then eventually, as all things do, it falls apart. Okay, and it falls apart basically in 2 stages, as I already alluded to. And this slideshow that I'm going to be basing these videos on deals with both of these kind of collapses. So there's the collapse in the West, which happens earlier and is occasioned by the arrival of the Huns and the penetration of German tribes into the Western Empire. And then there's the collapse in the East, which isn't quite as thorough, right? So the Roman emperors survive in Constantinople and hang on to some of their territory. But really their sort of hegemony as the dominant culture over this most of this area vanishes, right? It's replaced by the hegemony of the new caliphate. So one question that this raises is, well, why and how did this happen? One of the things about the high period of Roman power is that Rome had no real rivals in terms of major empires that were a big threat to it, right? This is very different from like the medieval period or the Renaissance, where a lot of the nations that we're talking about are engaged in constant warfare with other states that are pretty similar to them in power, right? So like France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, or Saxony, or whatever, right? These are kings who are like they are definitely not the only power on the block. They don't have this kind of dominant position compared to their neighbors, right? But Rome did. The only power that was really kind of close to rivaling them were their neighbors to the east, the Persian Empire. And those were rivals in the sense that the Persian Empire under the Sassanids could put armies into the field that could defeat Roman armies. But Rome was never really under huge threat from the Persian Empire, in the sense that if they lost a battle, if they lost even some wars, right, it never seemed to be the case that the Persians were going to conquer all of Rome, right? It just meant that the borders shifted a little bit, right? And the Persians would be paid some tribute, and so things would shift over to being advantageous towards the King of Kings in Ctesiphon. But what happened in the 5th century then is kind of surprising, because despite the fact that there's really no other group out there that is stronger than Rome and defeating them, nevertheless Rome is defeated. Okay? And this question of, well, why did Rome end, right? Both because it was so politically and militarily powerful, but also because it was so sort of culturally influential and people are very sort of interested in it, really became one of these big debated historical questions, right? So one of the sort of most well-known and influential early works of history was by Edward Gibbon, called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And it's this huge series of books which really kind of, it is other interests, but this is one of the things that it really kind of sets itself to wondering about, like, what are the causes of this decline and of this fall? And Gibbon is certainly, arguing, he thinks that, the fall comes, after a decline. So there's a period where Rome is strong and then Rome grows weaker. And so at least part of the explanation for why it ends is that, it's not what it once was. But of course that's a theory, it's a historical theory, and not every historian might agree. So one of the things that we're going to do in this video then, in the time that remains us, is we're going to talk a little bit about, well, how can we understand this end to Roman political, military, and cultural hegemony in the Mediterranean area? What are the causes of it? And we're going to talk about a few different ones, but I'm going to give you kind of a synthesis of what we think might be the most significant ones, and sort of put them together into an attempt to make the whole scenario make sense. So it certainly used to be the idea that Rome was a kind of a hollow shell by the time that it fell, right? That whereas Rome had had a high point of sort of power and glory, that by the time the 5th century rolls around, even the 4th century, right, it was kind of past its height, right? It was on the decline. Things were going downhill. And there may well be some truth to that, but the evidence is not as strong as for that thesis as historians once thought, right? More recent research has indicated that the economy, didn't collapse the way that it once was thought to have sort of completely collapsed. There is a fair amount of evidence to suggest that it had declined, right? And this comes from a few different sources. One of the things that definitely did happen was that Rome kind of ran out of silver, more or less. Its silver mines were depleted, and so its coinage really suffered and was adulterated with copper and things like that. So the value of the coinage went down, and there was inflation and that kind of thing. Another thing that seems to have happened is that there was a decline in the trade that was happening. Okay, so one of the interesting pieces of evidence that shows this is the fact that we can very accurately date when various wrecks that we find in the Mediterranean were sunk, right? And what we find is that there's a lot of wrecks of Roman ships from the 1st and the 2nd centuries of the Common Era, but far fewer from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, right? So what this suggests is that not that there were more storms or something, or more pirates in the 1st and 2nd centuries. The evidence doesn't suggest that. It just suggests that there were just a lot more ships that were sailing in those periods, right? And some percentage of them are sunk. And so if that's the case, then there does seem to have been a substantial decrease in sort of maritime traffic and trade across the Mediterranean in the later Roman Empire period, which may suggest an economic decline. But despite that fact, we have other evidence that suggests that even if, perhaps relative to its height, the Roman Empire was less strong than it had been, nevertheless it was still pretty strong. Okay, so we have documents that give us some indication of its tax revenues. We have documents that tell us the size of its military, the number of troops that it had under arms, and it has a really large army. Okay, and most of its tax revenue goes towards paying its army, and its army is sort of spread out along these borders in a very similar way to it has been for hundreds of years. And so, since the major threats that ultimately destroy its political control over its territory are military threats, right? They are invasions by people from outside of its borders. The strength of its military is quite relevant to this. Okay, and so, although of course the Roman Empire may have been less strong than it was on the one hand, and on the other hand it may still have been strong, I think the only way that we can understand the ultimate collapse of the Roman Empire is to say that, well, it's a combination of two things, right? Despite its strength, the Roman Empire has certain limitations that it can't transcend, physical, material, cultural limitations. And then it has various external stresses that it has to deal with. And what happens in these two different incidents, the crisis that happens in the 4th and 5th centuries in the West, and the crisis that happens in the 7th century in the East, just Rome is driven beyond the ability of its internal resources to cope with the threats and strife that it's facing. So what were these limitations that Rome faced? Well, you can see on the slide there, the sort of three main ones that I'm going to talk about. So first of all, its professional army was a paid army, and it consumed a lot of the economy of Rome, right? So, a lot of the governmental revenue of Rome, put it that way, something like 70 or 80%, right? Rome wasn't paying for pensions. Rome wasn't, funding very many things other than, the army mostly. It was also paying its bureaucrats and doing some public works, but not a lot, right? So mostly it's collecting taxes in order to pay its army. What this means is that when it loses control over parts of its territory, or even if parts of its territory are sort of damaged so as to damage its tax revenues, that means that it has difficulty paying its soldiers, and it has to potentially shrink its army. Okay, and so the collapse of Rome in the West and in the East happens kind of in steps, particularly in the West. And as pieces of it are kind of bitten away and chunks of it are taken outside of Roman imperial control, that reduces its tax revenue, which reduces its ability to pay its soldiers, decreases the size of its army, and therefore makes it have less relative power compared to its adversaries. So it's a kind of a snowball effect, right? Now, one of the things that I'll suggest is that, if things had gone differently, this snowball effect perhaps could have been reversed, right? If it had quickly organized itself to take back the parts of the empire that had been overrun, then, it recovers the tax revenues, restores its borders, perhaps it might have lasted longer than it did. But the Roman Empire had a real problem dealing with these kind of incursions of powerful military forces because the speed of communication and movement was so slow. And because the empire itself was so large, right? So although the Roman army was much, much larger than any of the adversaries that it was really facing, certainly during the 5th century, despite that fact, it couldn't really respond very well. Certainly it couldn't respond with its entire army to any of these threats because it had these huge long borders that had to continue to be garrisoned. Okay? So the fact that communication was slow through the empire and that movement, took weeks to send letters across the empire, it could take months to march armies, it meant that a lot of the time it was only the local forces that were dealing with the Germanic tribes that are crossing across the border, or the Arabic riders that are raiding and entering across into Egypt or Syria. And it takes quite a while for the Roman field armies to kind of get their act together and get to where they're needed. And in that time period, a lot can happen, right? Fields can be torched, Roman citizens can be killed or enslaved, right? And the armies that invaded themselves can just leave again or go somewhere else, right? And so that's an ongoing problem, and it's not a limitation that Rome can ever deal with. It's just a kind of a problem that a big empire in a sort of pre-railroad, pre-industrial revolution times have, right? And Rome was really geographically large, right? So this really compromised its ability to defend itself. The other thing that made this problem even worse was the fact that the Roman government was quite unstable, right? It worked pretty well when the people at the top were competent and obeyed, but it didn't have very good mechanisms for making sure that its rulers were actually any good, right? Because it was hereditary, right? Now, as you may have heard, Diocletian tried to fix that by setting up a scenario where there are two emperors at a time. They each have their area of control, right? They are grooming a successor who is their junior emperor, and the successor doesn't have to be, and probably shouldn't be, their child, right? And so this was an attempt to kind of resolve this problem of incompetent emperors, right? By having competent emperors who are in charge choose a successor who's also going to be competent. But that system didn't work, and it didn't work just because there was too much desire by Roman emperors to have their sons take over, even if that wasn't even if they weren't the best candidate for it, right? So Constantine was a child of a previous emperor, and was able to leverage that into becoming an emperor himself, and he just got rid of the whole sort of succession system that Diocletian had put in place, and some of his offspring were competent and some of them weren't so much. And the other problem too was that when you make the succession system hereditary, you often get succession struggles, right, where there wasn't a really strong tradition of like the oldest child has to inherit. And so what you often get is struggles between siblings, or you just have like uncles or cousins or things who think that they'd be a better fit. And what this means is that there are sort of two bad scenarios that crop up quite often in Roman history and in this time period that make a huge difference to the way that things play out, right? Particularly for the fall of the Western Roman Empire, right? One is that you have emperors who are firmly in charge but who are just no good, right? Either because they're young, like they're like 7, and so the rulership really isn't in their hands anyways, or because they are not interested or not competent, right? So that happens to a certain degree. One saving grace for some of this period is that when there's an incompetent kind of checked out emperor, often there'll be sort of a general who will be kind of ruling or at least overseeing military affairs in his name, right? And so that mitigates that a bit. But what's even worse is when there's an actual succession struggle. And these succession struggles can last sometimes for decades. When there's no single emperor who can command the allegiance of the army, then the army can't do anything, really, hardly anything, to deal with external threats, right? Because the different generals are worrying about each other. And risking your army fighting some Germans is, likely to lead to your downfall. And Roman politics was played for keeps, right? If you lost out politically, you were like, high up in the succession, and you were kind of considered by the army to be one of the people who would maybe make a good emperor, and like maybe you get crowned or something, but there's another emperor, and then you lose, you die, right? And your family dies, and your friends die, right? Everyone gets the axe, because that was the way that the game was played, and emperors did not like to leave potential rival claimants around, right? So it really meant that, you could not mess around with the succession struggle. That had to be where your focus was, and you had to deal with the emperor's problems after you settled your own survival, okay? And so that was a huge problem for Rome, because at a lot of critical junctures, Rome was effectively paralyzed, right? There were things that had to be done to save it, but the government was unable to do that because there was not an undisputed emperor. Okay? So those are kind of the internal limitations that face Rome. Another one that I'd mention that applies more in the later period is disgruntled sections within the Roman society itself. Okay, in particular, inside of the Eastern Roman Empire in the 7th century, there were a lot of different groups of Roman citizens and non-citizen inhabitants who were not really happy with the government, and a lot of this unhappiness was connected to religious factors. So basically, there were different sects of Christianity and then also non-Christians who lived within the empire's borders that were persecuted by the emperor. Right. So by the certainly by the end of the 5th century, the Roman emperors were all Christian, and they took one of their sort of roles as emperor to be sort of enforcing Christian orthodoxy within the empire. Right? So Constantine did this at the Council of Nicaea, right? Settled disputes about the nature of Jesus and his relation to God the Father, right? The Trinitarian doctrine. And the Roman emperors, extending all the way until, Rome vanishes entirely in the 15th century, the Roman emperors saw one of their roles as enforcing the correct doctrine within their domain. And by the 7th century, there were a lot of groups of Christians who disagreed with the official line, who had their own take on things, and they were persecuted and they were not happy with their rulers. In addition to that, there were Jews inside of the empire, there were Zoroastrians, there were pagan non-Christians, Gnostics. There were all kinds of different minorities, many of whom had to keep a very, very low profile. The empire had become increasingly religiously intolerant over time, and that led to increasing dissatisfaction among segments of its population. And so that meant that it had real trouble sort of getting unified support for its government, because its government was not that popular among a lot of its citizens. Okay? So that was another sort of internal problem. But those internal problems would not have led to the collapse of government authority without these external stresses that came in the form of large armies of people crossing the borders. Okay? And in the 4th and 5th century in the West, these are mostly German-speaking tribes, although there's some other people thrown in there, who are sort of pushed across the border by the arrival of the Huns. And in the 7th century, this is the Arab Muslims united under their new religion. So in the subsequent videos, I'm going to talk about the sort of details of each of these crises that destroy Roman authority in a particular area. So I'm just going to sort of quickly summarize a few of the details now. Right? So in the 5th century, these large confederacies of mostly Germanic-speaking tribes, right, who have sort of like almost like a hierarchy of kings, right? So you've got warband leaders who've sworn allegiance to a king, maybe sworn allegiance to another guy who's like the sort of king of kings, right? And so these are bands that travel as an entire sort of people. They have maybe a total population of like 50,000, 100,000, maybe 200,000 people, and can put like 10, 20, 30,000 warriors into the field. Each of these groups by themselves, is no match for the total might of Roman arms, but each of these groups by themselves is enough to, be a match for and possibly defeat the sort of standing armies that are near, one particular area of the border. Right? So the first big crossing is by the Visigoths in the late 4th century. They destroy a Roman army. There's another one in the early 5th century that crosses over into sort of Central Europe, but is defeated. Another one a few years later crosses over into France, and that one lasts, right? And that one is the one that's made up of the Vandals, the Suebi, the Alans, a few others. And after they succeed, right, they are very impressed by Roman culture mostly. And so what they try and do is they try and settle down and set themselves up as the new landlords, and they come to some sort of accommodation with the old landlords and take over some of their lands, maybe entirely get rid of them, or maybe keep on some of them. And as these groups continue and stabilize themselves and set themselves up as rulers, they gradually transform the culture, right? And the culture in these areas becomes a mix of Roman institutions and Germanic institutions. And this sort of sets the stage for the whole development of medieval Europe. Okay? One of the things that goes along with this is a massive economic and demographic collapse. Okay? So we don't know sort of exactly how to explain all of this collapse, right? So it seems to have been a whole bunch of things working together, right? So warfare can be extraordinarily destructive, right? You can have entire cities put to the sword, right? Wiped out entirely by these armies, right? You can have widespread destruction and property damage and that kind of thing. People can be driven into flight, and that itself, people often there's very high mortality, and a lot of people die when they're walking thousands of miles to try and escape from invaders and things like that. There definitely are some outbreaks of plague, of big epidemics that sweep through Rome, particularly a little bit later. So some combination of plague and famine and warfare over the course of a few hundred years dramatically reduces the population. And in particular, the cities that had been really the center of Roman culture, right, are reduced to shells of their former self in the former Western Empire, right? And the biggest transformation is the city of Rome. At its height, the city of Rome has a population of 1 million or so, and it had probably declined a little bit by the late Empire, but it was still large, 500,000 plus. And a few centuries later, its population is down to 10,000, right? So a tiny fraction of itself, right? Authors will talk about, the remnants huddling in these gigantic ruins that dwarf them, right? Because just the population is so much smaller. The city is huge and it's mostly ruined, right? People are just living in a small little bit of it. So that made a big difference too, right? The new culture was one that was much less literate, much less interconnected and cosmopolitan, so much more isolated, and it just transformed as a result of that, and we'll be exploring some of the ways that it transforms later in the course. So although the Western Roman Empire is transformed in this way, the Eastern Roman Empire isn't. It is, for geographical reasons, is preserved from having to deal with these armies. They can't conquer Constantinople, and they can't travel across into what's now Turkey and Syria and Egypt and all that kind of thing, right? And so that part of the empire is fine. And in the 6th century, it even sort of reestablishes itself in parts of the West. So under the Emperor Justinian, who's sort of the biggest name of the post-fall of the Roman West pre-rise of Muhammad. They reconquer North Africa, they reconquer Italy, they reconquer parts of Spain. So it's almost like starting to look like the old empire again. But it doesn't last beyond Justinian's reign much. And then, not too long after that, in the 7th century, the Arabs sweep out of Arabia and conquer big chunks of the Eastern Roman Empire. Right? So they conquer Egypt, they conquer Syria, they conquer chunks of Anatolia, so what's now Turkey, and the Eastern Roman Empire is reduced to kind of just like Constantinople, Greece, parts of the Balkans, and parts of Anatolia. So it becomes a shadow of its former self, and most of its former inhabitants are put into a new religious and cultural sphere, right? Arabic and Muslim. And so that transforms Egypt and Syria and all of these places, begins a process of transformation. And so these two events, the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, the fall of the Roman Empire in the East, put a curtain on the classical world. They begin a process by which the old Greco-Roman culture becomes something new. Now it influences the culture of the new Germanic kingdoms in the West, and it influences the Arabic Muslim culture that emerges in the East in a variety of different ways. But it is, it is a transition, and hence the, from classical to medieval that we're still kind of sticking with. But at the same time, we shouldn't look at this as like a sharp break, right? The break is at the sort of political and governmental level. The old governments, vanish or are drastically reduced in size and are replaced with new governments that are controlled by elites belonging to a different culture, and that then begins to reshape the whole sort of culture of the areas. So that concludes this first topic. I'm going to record some other videos to deal with the two halves of this story subsequently, the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the conquest of much of the Eastern Roman Empire by the Arab armies.